Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we're talking about our top 10 favorite new cards from Foundations and Foundations Jumpstart. Don't want to leave Jumpstart out because it's bringing a lot of cool new cards too. Joined with me today is Preston. Preston, how's it going, man?
Going pretty good. This might be my favorite set that we're going to talk about for a while.
Really?
It's actually genuinely making me consider getting back into Standard on Arena, and I hate it. I don't want to, but the set looks so good.
Oh yeah, honestly, this is such a baller set. It's got some classic reprints, some fun new cards, and it just seems it's kind of a Timmy's paradise, and Preston's a Timmy. We also have Jason with us today. Jason, how's it going?
Going good. Today was my last shift before I go on my hunting trip to Michigan, so I'm excited to do that. Gonna bring back some deer. I'm excited to have like a week and a half off of work. Also, the Lions are winning, and life is just so good. And this set is really cool, so life is just great all around.
I thought we were going to go a week without Jason mentioning the Lions, but no.
It's never, until the season is over, I'm going to mention them every week. I'm going to be wearing this every single week.
You know what, Jason, if you bring some deer jerky or something back for the boys, then you can talk about the Lions every day. It's cool, man.
Hey, man, you remember those venison meatballs that I brought?
They were great. And honestly, if my kid wasn't due in like 2 weeks, I would just be like, yo, take me with you, because I was wanting to go deer hunting this year, and I don't think I'm going to end up getting to. So maybe next year.
In the future, anytime you ever want to do that, you're more than welcome to hunt with me on my family's property. The only thing, you just have to pay for your own license and tags.
Right. But we'll that's for a separate conversation probably. But if you would like to support the show, you can do all the YouTube algorithm stuff. That being liking the video, leaving comments, checking out our other videos, being subscribed if you're not already. And then if you want to go the extra mile, you can head over to patreon.com/geekandseekyoutube. And if you want to keep the conversation going, you could also find a link to our Discord in the description as well. No news this week, but if you want a lot of news, we talked about a lot of the stuff on last week's podcast, news that was announced during MagicCon Vegas as far as like sets that are coming out next year, some rules changes, Universes Beyond shenanigans. So if you want all of our takes on that, go check out last week's episode. Please, it looks like that episode's flopping. Go give it some love, give it some views. All right, so as typical with our top 10 videos, we each have our own individual top threes, but we also have one card that we collectively all are like, hey, we might play that. So we're going to talk about that card first. Jason, can you lead us through that one card that we're all pretty high on?
Absolutely. Okay, so the first card that we're going to talk about, the card that we all really like from this set, is Blasphemous Edict. For 3 and 2 black, it's a sorcery, and it has an alternate casting cost. It says you may pay black rather than pay the spell's mana cost if there are 13 or more creatures on the battlefield. And then it says each player sacrifices 13 creatures of their choice. So it's kind of got that Blasphemous Act casting possibility where, if there's a lot of stuff on the battlefield, it only costs 1 mana. That's the same with Blasphemous Act. And then the thing that this does a little bit better than Blasphemous Act is getting rid of stuff because it causes people to sacrifice. So your exiles, or your indestructible cards, those can get taken care of. Anything with like Shroud or Hexproof, player has to sacrifice it. That's not a target, so that gets around that. And I really like this card a lot because I think that it's just going to slot into a lot of black decks. Late game, this might not be as powerful of a card because there might just not be as many things on board. But early to late, like mid game, when you still have at least 2 other people at the table, this is probably going to be cast for 1 most of the time. Like I would say probably 85 to 90% of the time you're going to be able to play this for 1 mana. But even if you can't play it for 1 mana, 5 mana for this effect is really not a bad price to pay. It's not like the Blasphemous Act where you have to pay 9 if you don't meet the requirements to, deal damage to 7 creatures. Like that just doesn't It doesn't feel very good paying that much. You really want to be paying the 1, but this card, it's okay if you pay the 5 because that's not a terrible cost for the effect that you're getting. Not being an instant does hurt the card a little bit, but I still think that it's powerful enough to slot into a majority of the decks that can run it.
Well, yeah, it would be probably kind of cracked if it was an instant, but most board wipes are sorcery. But okay, here's a couple gripes I have with this card. I am high on it, but here's if I'm going to play devil's advocate, it doesn't scale the same way that Blasphemous Act does with casting cost. Blasphemous Act is almost always 1 mana, almost always, and if not, you're not paying very much mana. You're maybe paying 2, maybe 3 mana. It scales for 1 mana for each creature. It's 1 mana or it's 5 mana. There's no in between. And there are times where you're going to want to wipe the board when there is not 13 creatures in play. They're just like, there's enough engine pieces here, there's threats, I'm going to die to commander damage, something like that. So it's very important to try to wipe the board even if we don't get to the 13. With that said, a 5 mana Wrath, it's not unplayable. Like Blasphemous Act, you're never paying the full casting cost, right? Because you're not going to cast a board wipe if there's no creatures, right? So you're never actually doing that with Blasphemous Act. But here, like if you have to pay the full casting cost, 5 mana for a Wrath, not terrible. The other thing that the Devil Advocate needs to point out is that there are going to be times where there's like a token play or something and they have way more than 13 creatures, in which case they're like, oh, okay. And then they still have most of their board and they're fine because you don't get to choose what's gain sacrifice. They get to pick. So they'll just get rid of all their 0/1 plants and then they'll keep all their engine pieces, right? But again, 5 mana is not terrible and it gets around indestructible, like you said, because it's sacrifice. So it's not going to be my go-to board wipe because you have more efficient ones like Damnation and Toxic Deluge. You have ones that mana-hungry decks would like more, like Decree of Pain or like stuff like that. So there's other black board wipes that maybe people will think about more, but I feel like this one's really good and should be considered in at least a decent amount of decks. What do you think, Preston?
Yeah, I probably would never run this in a black-white deck because at that point you just don't need another board wipe in that, but really any other color combination, I think this is playable. My gripe is definitely that the token player example. I think that's the one where this is going to whiff the hardest most often. But even then, you're still clearing 13 creatures out of the way. That's not nothing. So I still really like it.
Here's the thing that I would say as an argument against, well, obviously the token decks are going to be where this card is not going to be the strongest, but if you're able to catch the token player as they're still building up their board state and maybe they just made like 25 tokens on their turn or something, I mean 13 is still going to cut into a decent amount of what they have on the board, and depending on what they choose to sacrifice, it could open up possibilities for other people at the turn to slow them down additionally. So I think that there's definitely going to be opportunities for this card to succeed against token decks, but it definitely is going to whiff more times than not versus that particular strategy, which, you know, tokens is probably the most popular thing to do in Commander.
It's definitely up there, but even then, like, how often do you actually see token decks?
Right. Does that mean you're going to run into it every single time you sit down at a game? No, probably not. But even in that case, you know, you could use it in a political way where you make a deal with the token player like, hey, you just leave me alone for a little bit and I'll get rid of their stuff too. Like, you know, you could use it in that sense. But I think that I agree with your point, Preston. Black-white doesn't really need this card, but basically any other black deck is going to find some use out of this.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and head into our personal top threes. Preston, why don't you start us off with your first card?
Yeah, first up, I have Quilled Greatwurm. For 4 and 2 green, it's a 7/7 creature worm with trample. When a creature you control deals damage during your turn, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and you may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other cost. I just love green. I've always loved green. I'm always going to love green. This is one of the most green cards they've ever printed. put counters on stuff, recur your creature, trample. It's a good time.
This card's kind of insane. Like if you're playing like a counters deck of any kind, yeah, this just seems absolutely insane. It's a great way to like get have recursion. Great way to get things back, which is also good because it specifically wants to send your creatures into the red, right? Because that's how you're going to get how this by itself is going to put counters on things. But then as a result, you are going to have things die. Even if your creatures are getting huge with the counters, you are still going to have things die. But then the Quilled Greatwurm is just like, okay, well, I'll help you get them back. So I think it's actually a really nice payoff to help keep it aggro. And it's also a 6-mana 7/7 with trample just to start off with. So it's hopefully going to get to stick around for a little bit. Yeah, it's a very Timmy card. It's a very Preston card. It's cool.
So based on the way that you phrased it, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with this. You can only cast it from your graveyard by removing counters and paying the mana.
I misread that.
You can't play other cards from your graveyard with that effect.
Okay, I still think it's decent though.
It's still really good. Even because it's 6 mana, you're not really going to play this too early in the game when you don't have a board state. The ideal spot to play this is when you already have a decent amount of creatures on the battlefield that are going to be able to deal combat damage, and then you play this, you attack with those creatures get bigger based on how much damage they deal to a player. Oh no, it just says whenever they deal combat damage. So I read that wrong too. That just makes it even crazier.
Jason and I are all sorts of messed up tonight.
Just one combat with this, and you're going to have an insane amount of power on your board just after one swing. Depending on the deck that you're playing, you pair this with an extra combat step. Now you're just creating huge amounts of defense for you. And it's going to have a pretty significant second turn if you're able to do that. Adding haste to this somehow with like a Swiftfoot Boots or a Lightning Greaves or something like that, that's just going to even make this better. So I think that this is a mid to late game powerhouse. And then the fact that you can just play it again from your graveyard, like that just means that it works well with certain sack outlets. Whether it's sack outlets that are going to give you card draw like Greater Good, or things like Phyrexian Altar or Ashnod's Altar that are going to give you mana for sacrificing it, because then you could just cast it again. I think that this card is really, really cool.
It almost seems like a trap now that I'm thinking about it, because in order for it to get the creatures to get the counters, they have to survive combat. And now hopefully they already have some counters. Hopefully they already have decent bodies. But you have to send them into combat with no guarantee that they're going to survive, no guarantee that they're even going to get the counters. So that's kind of sus. And then also, like, okay, the way I originally read it, when you could just remove counters to get anything back from your graveyard, that would be kind of busted. I'm kind of glad that I misread that. But even then, like, aren't there better uses? Like, it's a really steep cost to get it back. Like, at that point, aren't you better off just, like, playing a draw spell, deploying another threat, something like that at that point, instead of removing a bunch of counters from your other things and then also dumping 6 mana to get it back? So I feel like this card, like, it reads really cool. Like, I think a lot of +1/+1 counters decks are going to play this. And if you play those kind of decks, you don't really care about optimization. You're just playing a bunch of cool stuff. So maybe what I'm saying here doesn't matter, but, like, I'm just saying, like, it almost feels like a trap.
Well, it's not a trap if it's already a +1/+1 counters deck, because you're just going to have those counters anyways. If you're throwing this into an otherwise random green deck, you might have problems.
Well, sure.
But yeah, no, you run this in the counters deck, it's going to get back pretty easily. They are going to need to have exile.
Even if you're not running it in a counters deck, you can still run this into a lot of green decks. If those green decks really care about combat, like if you're trying to get creatures out and swing and deal damage. First of all, this is a type of ability that pairs really well with Death Touch creatures.
and trample. Like if you have a commander that like gives your creatures trample or something, that way you're, also getting in the damage.
But then also there is a 2-mana instant in green that makes all your stuff indestructible. So you could just swing, cast, heroic intervention, make your stuff indestructible. Then no matter what, your creatures are going to survive combat and get the counters.
Okay, that's cool in theory. And then you pass the turn and you're like, all right, next turn I'm going to win. And someone wipes the board and you're like, oh, I already used my heroic intervention.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing about that. Sometimes you just don't win games.
Fair enough. But speaking of +1/+1 counter shenanigans, Jason, why don't you lead us through your first card?
Yeah, so this is a +1/+1 counters card that I thought was pretty cool. It is Mossborn Hydra. For 2 and a green, it is a creature elemental Hydra. It's a 0/0 with trample, and it says this creature enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's going to enter as a 1/1, and it has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, double the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. So I think that into a majority of decks that have green, this card can find a home, even if it's not a counters themed deck. Maybe if you're getting into like the 4-color or the 5-color decks, maybe you don't throw it in as much. But if you have a 3-color green deck or a 2-color deck that has green, and especially if you have a mono green deck, this card is going to be an absolute star for you. You're likely running a decent amount of green ramp in those colors, so you're going to be able to put lands onto the battlefield. You might be running cards like Exploration or what's the creature? Azusa, Lost but Seeking, where you're getting these additional land drops. If you are running in a +1/+1 counters deck, you're likely going to have stuff that allows creatures to enter with additional +1/+1 counters or something like that. So it's going to enter with 2, and then you play 1 land for a turn. Now it's a 4/4 with trample for 3 mana. That's a good cost on itself. Then you play a ramp spell because this is 3 mana. It's so feasible to play a ramp spell or 2 when like the same turn that you play this card and just make it really big the turn that you play it. So it's going to be a great creature to have on defense, but then you pair it with a Lightning Greaves or something that's going to give it haste. You're going to have a pretty big beater for not a whole lot of mana. So I just think that this card is really cool. I think it's going to be a fun card to play, and I think that you're going to see it a lot more often than you might think you will.
I think it's cool. I kind of wonder how, in the long term, it's going to compare to Managorger Hydra. Do you guys remember that one? It's a very similar card. So 3 mana, 1/1 with trample, and then whenever any player casts a spell, you put a 1/1 counter on it. So this reads very similar to me. The one thing I would say about Managorger being maybe better is that it's whenever any player casts a spell. So that's what we do in Magic, is we're going to cast spells. So it gets pretty big pretty fast. I've played it before. It gets huge really fast. The difference, and so the way that might be better than Mossborn is that Managorger is with every player casting spells, and players are often going to cast more than one spell a turn. But then also, when you get later on into the game, if you're not having good card draw, if you don't have your engine set up, you might actually get to a point in the late game where you miss land drops, which would suck for Mossborn. The reason I think Mossborn might actually be better, though, is that even if you're just playing it fairly in those multicolor decks, like Jason was talking about multicolor decks, multicolor decks are green decks. They're green decks that are splashing other colors because they want the ramp and they want the fixing. So yes, you're going to have your 3 visits and your rampant growth and all that stuff, but you're also probably having fetch lands, which those by themselves are multiple land drops, right, for your fixing. So this, and it's doubling. It's not just 1/1/+1 counter like Managorger is one spell, 1 counter. This is no 1 land, double the counter. So I think it's actually going to scale faster, especially if you specifically build around it. If you are actually a landfall deck, I think this card is going to get very scary very fast. And if you are putting it in those kind of decks, it's going to perform very well. So yeah, seems good.
Here's my thing. I think that the landfall is better than the Managorger Hydra because you're taking the buffs into your own hands. You're not relying on your opponents to cast things. Your opponents can see that and just be like, okay, well, I only cast one spell that I really need to cast this turn.
No, they won't.
Or they'll let it, like, they'll play a couple of spells and then they'll let it get a decent size. You know, it might not be too huge by the time that it comes to your turn and you can attack. But how do you know that one of those spells that one of your 3 opponents is going to cast isn't going to be a targeted removal spell to kill the Managorger Hydra once it's gotten too big?
Well, the same thing applies with this. It does. This is basically the same card. It doesn't have any kind of protection.
But my counter for that is because you can build up Mossborn Hydra very, very quickly on the turn that it came in, you probably can utilize it earlier, and you can utilize it for a lot more damage than you can with the Managorger Hydra because it's not dependent on what your opponents are doing.
Thoughts, Preston?
Yeah, this card is great. As someone who has a landfall deck, this card is never not going to be good. Like, you can have a pretty small hand size at the moment. You're going to find a way to make this thing huge in a turn or two. Landfall decks are just so good at that. They're so consistent. This thing is going to deal a ton of damage in the coming months.
Cool in land decks. Probably cool in +1/+1 counter decks. Yeah, it'll be cool to see in action. My first card is Raise the Past. This is a sorcery for 2 white. So 4 mana. You return all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Jason thinks this card sucks, but
no, that's not what I said. I said mid. It's mid.
Preston and I like it though. So what I like about it is I have grown very fond of aggro decks. Except the guys made me take my last aggro deck apart, so now I need to build a new one. But I really like these decks that come in and immediately start doing damage, put a clock on board, start killing people, so we don't have a bunch of 3 and 4 hour long commander games like a lot of our games tend to go when people are taking a long time to do their turns or they're having Dirtle Fest or whatever. No. Get in there with the aggro, get her done. And the reason that has to do with this is that the first board wipe, you're done for. The first time someone gets some good blocks, you're done for. This is a good way to just efficiently get your stuff back. Plus, it's going to give you even more value than you think because a lot of those low mana creatures are also giving you some other kind of value. Like, so specifically in the one I had several creatures that were like the Novice Inspector, right? Enters the battlefield, you get a clue. Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. You have all these little extra pieces. Prosperous Innkeeper enters the battlefield, you get a treasure. All these extra little things. So not only are you getting all of your bodies back for 4 mana, but you're also going to get all those enter the battlefield effects again. And that's quite relevant as well, because in order to have your aggro deck scale up, you do have to make sure that they're giving you more value than just the impressive body for their stat line. So I actually really like this. I think it's a good way for aggro to play into the late game, recover from a board wipe, stuff like that.
Yeah, White loves Weenie Hurt Junior cards, and this is one of the best cards they've ever gotten for that strategy. I love it.
Did you want to say anything else about it, Jason, or why did you think it was mid?
You don't have anything else, Preston?
No, I like little guys. White.
Whoa, pause.
Is just fun to play for that.
Whoa, Preston likes little guys.
No, did he? Question mark. I mean, yeah, if that's all you got, I just think that this card is mid. It's only returning creatures, and outside of the specific decks that build around like cheap mana value creatures, you're not gonna see a ton of play with this card in Commander. It's really good in those decks that bring back those creatures, but I just don't think that it's as powerful as you guys are saying, especially considering how much people have actually come around on Graveyard Hate. Graveyard Hate is it's something that a lot of people think about now when they're building decks. And one of the main reasons that that's the case is because they've printed a lot of cards that are specific graveyard hate. I mean, you just think about Farewell. It's the best board wipe ever, and it targets graveyards. I don't know. I think that it's cool. For 4 mana, it's efficient for sure, especially if you're building up your graveyard to be really big and you can bring a lot of stuff back with it. That's a lot of value you're just getting for 4 mana. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that it's going to find a slot into a ton of decks.
Well,
I mean, it's going to find it's going to find its way into all those decks that have those low mana value creatures that you're swinging.
That was my point. Like, I'm not trying to put this in every white deck, Jason. I just want it in my aggro decks and my little guy decks. Like, if you're like Preston has a Lurrus deck, it's probably going to go in that deck. It's probably going to go in my new aggro deck when I build a new aggro deck. It should go in a lot of those like just white small creature utility. Like, do you guys remember my God Eternal Oketra deck I used to have? Like, I would just play a lot of tiny little white utility creatures. Like, this would go in there if that deck was still together. Like, those, I'm not saying it goes in all white decks. I'm just saying it goes in the decks that want it, which is like what our list should be. It's not just like, oh, here's a bunch of generically good cards. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make for good content or a good list. Like I just wanted to go in those decks. But you saying that you stock the graveyard is kind of interesting, because I think my last aggro deck was Celestia. I think I'm going to go Boros this time. And with red, you do have the options of doing like rummaging and looting as well for your card advantage, because then you could be putting stuff in your graveyard on purpose, and then this card really slaps. But as far as your graveyard hate argument goes, okay, yes, but so many other things are fizzled to graveyard hate, right? I have a Muldrotha deck. You exile my graveyard, GG's, mate. But the only two pieces of graveyard hate that we see with any semblance of regularity are Bojuka Bog and Farewell. Farewell, it just ends games, period. Like, most decks will just be like, well, I'm in top deck mode now, and that's just Farewell. Farewell is a messed up card. But the other one, Bojuka Bog, like, there are a lot of times where people are just like, well, I don't want to not hit my land drop, so here's a Bojuka Bog on turn 3. I'll hit the guy with the fetch land in his graveyard, right? So it's like not even that bad. Bojuka Bog, you have so little control over the timing. So I just think you can't just use graveyard hate as an excuse, I think. Like, if they got it, they got it, but just go for it.
I didn't just use graveyard hate. I said it was too narrow. And if someone hits your graveyard and exiles it, then this card does nothing. Because it's only narrow, because it's so narrow, and you're not going to slot it into every white deck or even a majority of white decks, that's the only reason why I said it's mid. I never said it sucks. I just said it was mid.
If I make you use your graveyard hate on all of my 1 and 2 drops, I've won that encounter. I could lose the game, but I have won.
No, you didn't. Not if you're trying to play this card. Not if you're trying to play this card, because I just prevented you from getting so much value. For 4 mana, you could have brought 15 things back if you built your graveyard up enough. So no, you didn't win that interaction because I prevented you from getting an immense amount of value for 4 mana. So no, you didn't win that interaction.
I also think
but you had to stop a bunch of 1-drop, so I won.
I do agree that like you could build around it to where you're like semi-building around this card and similar cards, because there's other cards that do this kind of thing. You could intentionally build around it. But I actually kind of just like the idea of just like someone board wiped and you're just like, okay, I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to cast this for 4 mana, already have a decent board, maybe brought most of my things back. And then you still have some mana left over, hopefully, to do some other things, which I think is really impactful, because usually what ends up happening is someone, or actually, you know what's really good is you're the aggro deck, right? You attack, you get in all your damage, right? And you're like, all right, I need to wipe the board. You cast the board wipe, right? You still have a little bit of mana. Then you cast this. You got to rebuild before everyone else. That seems cash money, which also seems plausible if you're a Boros deck and you Blasphemous Act than this, because that's only 5 mana. You clear the board, you rebuild first.
Or if you're a Ozox player and you're playing Blasphemous Edict.
Yeah. There you go.
I was going to say, this can work with any 2 color combination that includes white. You can build a small guy deck in basically any color combination.
All right.
I'm not
so
saying
it
you have
still
to,
works,
but you could.
So it still only works for one type of deck, no matter what colors you use.
Yes, but it's awesome.
Yeah, but I'm
it's
saying it doesn't have
awesome
to
in
be
that
mono
one
white.
deck. In the little dude's deck, it is really good. All right. We spent way too much time talking about that card, Preston. Take us through your second card.
All right, next up, I have Scrawling Crawler for 3. It's an artifact creature, Phyrexian construct. It's a 3/2. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card, and whenever an opponent draws a card, that player loses 1 life. I'm a huge fan of group huggy style cards. I can sometimes be a fan of group slug cards, and I really like this one because it's a combo, and it gets around one of the things that group hug cards can sometimes hurt you with, and that's everyone else gets the advantage of the card, then someone kills your group hug piece and you don't even get it. I've had that happen. Other people have had that happen. It sucks. So if people want something out of this, they have to wait for your next turn and not kill your thing. So I do like how that has built-in incentive to not remove it.
Yeah, I also like those kind of cards. I like Group Hug, and then I also have recently gotten really into Group Slug too. I actually in MagicCon I played against 2 separate decks that they were like, "Oh yeah, I'm Group Hug," but then they played on turn 9. They're like, "Here's a bunch of cards that punish you for drawing all those extra cards." You're like, "Whoa!" But this card doesn't even keep it a secret that you're trying to do that. You're just like, "Yeah, you're gonna draw extra cards." But yeah, you're going to take some damage. And it's also what I actually really like about this is, one, it's colorless. So those different decks go across different colors. So the fact that this is colorless means it can go in any of those decks that care to have it. But I also think in some ways it might be better than some of those other cards that do similar things because it's a body. Because it's a body means it can contribute to attacking, blocking, easier to get back from your graveyard, stuff like that. So I think that's relevant too. So yeah, really like this card.
This is not a group hug card. It's just not. It's just not. I don't care that it's drawing everybody a card. It's dealing damage to them when they draw that card, and it's dealing damage to them
it's group hug
when they draw their card for turn.
Yeah.
So, and any other card. So this is not a group hug card. I don't care. It's just not.
Well, okay, but if
I
you're...
almost put this on my list because I really, really, really like this card. I'll tell you this, boys. You may or may not see this card in my Obeka Splitter of Seconds deck. Ooh. You may or may not see this card in that deck because it synergizes pretty well with that.
Yeah, so if you want to see that deck that Jason's talking about, that will be in the Secret Santa episode of our Commander gameplay series. That will be coming out, I don't know, like the second week of December or something like that. So make sure you subscribe to see that when it comes out. We haven't filmed it yet. But yeah, that'll be really spicy. Yeah, but yeah, I'm high on this.
Also, it is a construct, which is a little... important to keep track of.
That's relevant.
Yeah. Jason, walk us through your second card.
My second card is Shroofus, Sproutsire. For 2 and a green, it's a legendary creature Saproling. It's a 1/1 with trample, and it has, whenever a Saproling you control deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens. As far as power, this card is fine. It's not overpowered. It's not really super duper strong, unless you're building the deck. Like, if you're building this as the commander and you're building the deck around Saprolings and you care about Saprolings.
That's like the only time you play it, right?
Then this is a really, really good commander. Outside of that, it's not that strong. It's not that great. But I mean... look at this guy. Look at him. He's so cute. He's got a little mushroom head and his little slug eyes are popping out of his little mushroom cap. That's so adorable. Look at him. He's just so cute.
Yeah, this was one of the...
Go ahead, Preston.
Oh. I was going to say, this is one of the cards that was in my top 5 when I was deciding which ones I wanted to include on my list, and I didn't want to cut it, but luckily I saw Jason had it on his, so I was like, okay, we can still talk about it, so I don't have to include it, and I can choose some other ones, but man, this card rocks. It's so fun.
It's so adorable.
Yeah. So in the Goldfish group chat, Niatuk, one of our other editors, he knew that someone on Commander Clash was probably going to want to brew this. So he's like, hey, just so you know, here's a link to a search on Scryfall to look at all the saprolings that exist, just to help make building your deck easier. You click on it. This is the only card that shows up. It's the only creature that is actually a saproling. Like, if you don't count like changelings, shapeshifter or whatever, like, this is the only saproling. All other saprolings are things that make saproling tokens, which is, I think, hilarious. So what you actually do is you just play all those Army in a Can cards, which are all really cool, actually. Like, Preston's played a lot of those cards before, even on our show. Watch our gameplay show. So, those are really cool. They're really popular. They're very green in design. Something I didn't think about, though, is that it's 3 mana, so it can come down early, and it has Trample. You know why it has Trample as a 1/1? They want us to buff it up. They want us to commander damage people, because it will count itself. If it deals 1 damage, you make 1 saproling.
Yeah.
So
yes,
we're going
saproling
Voltron. And this is something that we talked about in the Voltron episode of our podcast a few months ago, is that you need to have other creatures in your deck in case your Voltron commander gets like booted out. This is one of the best options for doing that, because assuming you get several good hits in, you're in green, so you're probably not ever going to get mana locked out of using your commander. But let's say that happens. You are going to be left behind with a giant board of saplings, and that's awesome.
Yeah, this can slot into any deck that deals in like +1/+1 counters, or just like buffing creatures in general, because even if you just buff this a couple of times, you're going to start making a bunch of tokens that you can either use as like sacrifice fodder. You can buff up those tokens and use them to swing, and if you have this on the battlefield, those tokens are going to make more saprolings.
I guess that's true. I guess if you can guarantee that it can snowball, then I guess you probably could just run it by itself, because the tokens it makes could go on to make more tokens. So I guess if you're specifically buffing them up or giving them evasion, I guess you probably could just run it on its own outside of a saproling deck.
And then being able to give your whole board double strike, that's going to be really powerful in this too.
That would be gross.
But mainly, it's just adorable, man. Look at this guy. I just want to give him a hug.
There's one problem with it, though. I wish it was a black and a green, because there's a lot of black saproling stuff, and if I'm going to run a saproling commander deck, I want him to be the commander, but I also want the black stuff, which is kind of making me sad.
It doesn't feel like it.
At least you have options. Like, there's Slimefoot, right? And he's not a very good commander, but he's at least a body that makes saprolings in those colors. And then if you want to go Jund, there's also like a team up card that's Slimefoot and someone else, if you want to go Jund. So at least you have...
Yeah, but that's not Shroofus.
Well, he got me there. That's true.
This is my man Shroofus we're talking about. Look at that guy. If you're running saprolings, you want him as the commander. He's that guy.
I can't argue that.
Morgan, you gotta name your son Shroofus.
No, I'm not doing that. My second card is a card that I felt like we couldn't do this episode and not talk about. This is Bloodthirsty Conqueror. This is for 3 black, so 5 mana. It's a 5/5 vampire knight with flying and death touch. So already, just a cool body. This is the kind of stuff that Mythics used to be, and like pew boomer magic. But whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. So you could read this as your creatures have pseudo lifelink. It's not as good as lifelink, right? Because it doesn't work in combat. But it kind of works that as you're hitting your opponents, you're also gaining life. That sounds really cool. You know what's really cool about this card, though? It combos with like 5 different cards, and several of which are getting reprinted in a standard. So not only is this card going to be combos galore in Commander, but even in Standard, this might be a viable combo deck option, and that sounds awesome. Because already a 5-mana 5/5 with flying and death touch that might gain you some life, you could play that and people won't laugh at you, especially if you're a vampire deck, especially if you're a night deck, especially if you're a death touch deck or a flying deck or a life gain deck. There are so many decks you could just play this and people will just be like, yeah, okay. But then the fact that there are cards that combo with it, just mwah, it's beautiful. So as an example, there's, I think it's Enduring Tenacity. It's the black Enduring Cycle from Duskmourn. That's one of the cards that combos with it. So specifically, this says when an opponent loses life, you gain life, and then that card says whenever whenever you gain life, an opponent loses life. So then they loop with each other. So all you have to do, you have both pieces in play. One player changes their life, the loop starts, you win the game. And there's a lot of other cards that do this. The more classic example of this is Exsanguine Blood with Sanguine Bond. That's the more popular example of this combo, but it's the same thing in essence. But I just think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and I like I like that this card, it does the thing that Exquisite Blood does, where anytime someone loses life, doesn't matter what they're losing life from, you're going to gain that life. So I think that that's a really cool aspect of it. And I mean, like you said at the beginning, a 5-mana 5/5 flying death touch, that's a solid body. You know, I've said this before on the channel. I like to look at creatures like this and say, if it didn't have that just static ability, how is it for its mana cost, its power and toughness, and its keyword abilities? Like, how is it just as that creature? So even if you don't necessarily have a way to start comboing off and making people lose life so you're gaining a bunch of life, it's going to do work as a 5/5 flying death touch beater.
It doubles your life gain if you have life gain creatures. It has infinite combo potential. It's a 5/5 for 5. It's a flyer, it's a death toucher, it's a knight, and it's a vampire. Every word on this card is there to make it better, and it's kind of gross. I do love it, but it is a little gross.
Also, shout out, nasty. It says Exquisite Blood in the flavor text. Shout out.
Yeah, that is cool. I didn't catch that. That is nice. Well,
Wait,
do you guys?
I have to look something up. Is this the creature that is featured on Exquisite Blood?
Well, it's a vampire that's on it, so I mean, I don't know if it's this specific creature, but it is a vampire. Preston, do you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of old school core set classic Baneslayer Angel. And Baneslayer Angel was like the card for a long time. 5-mana flyer with all these keywords. Oh, it's epic. But then, like, by today's standards, it's just like, yeah, it's cool. Like, Angel decks played, and that's about it. Like, this is kind of what that reminds me of, except it's like they cranked it up a lot, because now there's like a lot of decks that even if they don't have the combo, they might think about playing it.
This does not appear to be the creature that's featured on Exquisite Blood. I feel like a real opportunity was missed there.
Yeah, it's close enough. They got it with the flavor text. Okay, so I should also mention that like a lot of the alt arts of this set are really cool. The anime foiling whatever on this one specifically is insane. Yeah.
And it's like $200.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where I'm not buying it, but I'm just saying it looks cool. Preston, why don't you lead us through your last card?
All right. Last up, I have Ozox, the Clattering King. For 2 and a black, it's a legendary creature, skeleton noble. Can't block, and when he dies, you create Jumble Bones, a legendary 2/1 black skeleton creature token with this creature can't block, and when this creature leaves the battlefield, you return target card named Ozox, the Clattering King, from your graveyard to your hand. I'm just interested in building this as a commander deck. You get around commander attacks almost the entire game. You can do a bunch of infinites with it, with sacrifice outlets. You can get around removal with sacrifice outlets. I just feel like you do some fun stuff with this. I'm excited to try it out. I want to do some brewing.
When I was at MagicCon, I was playing a game of Commander with Tomer, and Pleasant Kenobi. And the president of Wizards of the Coast came up to our table, and he gave us a bunch of packs of Jumpstart for Foundations. And he said, winner gets these. And this card was in one of those packs, and Tomer just gave it to a fan who was like a bystander. And the fan was just going off. He was so... First of all, this is just a cool story. Like, what is life? It's so cool. But then at the same time, this fan's just standing there, and his brain's going like all the pieces are coming together. This fan's like, this is the coolest. This is the coolest. Because like Preston said, there's so many combos and weird, tricky things you can do with it. I just wanted to tell that story because I thought it was a cool story. But yeah.
It is a cool story. I can't believe you didn't tell us that.
But this just seems like a really cool card. I've also thought that maybe it would be fun to try brewing it. I might just brew it because I don't think this is going to say... It's $6 right now, but that's because the set's not out. It's not going to be that expensive. I can't imagine. It's an uncommon. So
it's an uncommon.
Yeah, and I think that Foundations Jumpstart is going to be very popular. I can't imagine this stays very expensive. So I might brew it, and if I like it, I might build it. We'll see. But it seems cool.
So, to me, I don't think that this card is very good in the 99. There's definitely going to be some decks where it's going to do work, but I think that this is going to be, like Preston said, a really, really cool commander to build around. I think that this is going to be a really strong commander deck just because of the combo potential. And it seems like it's just going to be fun. It seems like it, because it doesn't innately do anything that's crazy broken. Especially because it's only mono black if you're building it as a commander. But you're just going to have a lot of fun playing with this, and you're going to have a lot of turns where you're doing a bunch of stuff, and it's just going to feel good and be a fun time, while not seeming too oppressive for your opponents. So I think that this card is really cool. It's going to lead to a lot of fun commander games.
There are some commanders that have like that get around the commander tax thing, and a lot of them are annoying and people hate them. I don't think this one is going to have that issue, really. I feel like this one's pretty fair compared to most of those. Like the ninja one.
Yeah.
And I always like a little cheating that doesn't piss people off too much, so seems fun.
Yeah, here for it. All right, Jason, why don't you lead us through your last card?
So my last card that I wanted to talk about was Rev Tithe Extractor. It is a legendary creature human rogue for 3 and a black. It's a 3/3, and it says whenever you attack, target creature gains death touch until end of turn. Then it says whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token, then look at the top card of that player's library and exile it face down. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. Anything that lets you steal stuff from your opponents in exile, they can't look at it or know what it is, and you can cast it whenever you want, even if this card leaves the battlefield. Those cards are always really fun and really powerful. But then the fact that you're going to be able to give a creature that you have death touch whenever you attack. That death touch is almost going to guarantee that something's going to get through, depending on what the board state's looking like. If somebody doesn't have a creature that they want to sacrifice, or if they don't have an indestructible creature that won't die to the death touch, you're likely going to be able to get through on at least one player. And even if the card that you take from them isn't something that you want to cast or is going to cast, you're still like making them go down a card that they have access to, and you're getting a treasure token. I really like this. I think that it's going to find a slot into a bunch of decks. It's not an auto-include in black decks by any means, but any deck that you have where it has black in it and you want to be attacking with creatures, you're going to find a spot for this because it's going to give one of your creatures death touch every time that you attack. And it's going to ramp you by giving you a treasure token. And it's going to give you card advantage by stealing one of your opponent's cards. All of that being a 4/4 for a 3/3 for 4 mana. And it has 2 relevant creature types being a human rogue. I think that this card is really, really good.
This card's going to be so good in my Mari deck. I'm so excited to put it in there.
Yeah, it's going to be really good. Because you care about the treasures. And don't you also care about stealing stuff from exile, like at least somewhat, right?
And rogues.
Yeah. So
if you block my creatures, they all have death touch, so they die and then go to exile. and then if I hit you again, I get to make treasures and draw cards. So if I have this out with my commander, you either have to lose your creature to exile, or I'm going to steal something out for your library. Either way, I'm getting card advantage, and that feels pretty good.
And you make a treasure no matter what.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Yeah, as long as a creature you control hits, as long as that happens, then yeah, you get the
Well,
treasure.
I mean, in that situation that Preston presented, I imagine that probably 95% of the time a creature's going to hit somebody.
Right. I agree with Jason that this probably goes in the home of a lot of decks. Like theft decks are going to want it, rogue decks are going to want it, some human decks might want it. Some treasure decks might want it, death touch decks. Most death touch decks are green, but yeah, this is definitely an option if you want to go Golgari or something.
Also, look at Riv. She kind of a baddie.
Well, I was also going to say she's kind of a waifu, and there are some simps who will just buy this card for that reason alone. So thanks for confirming that point as well,
choose the anime one on this.
Definitely
There's not a non-anime version.
Yeah. The other thing though is like Jason's right that it is ramping with the treasure tokens, but notably this is also not one of those theft effects where you can spend any kind of mana. You do actually have to pay the specific color restrictions. So if depending on your deck, maybe that's not really much of an ask. But if this is your commander and you're a mono black deck, you can build around it some, right? Like there's some mana rocks that tap for any color, some lands that tap for any color, stuff like that. But then these treasure tokens are really going to be helpful if you're actually trying to cast those spells that you are stealing from your opponent. So really, overall, just a really neat card. I like it.
That's one of the reasons why it making treasure tokens is really powerful, because you can use the treasure tokens to make whatever color of mana you need.
Yeah. And it giving at least one creature death touch. Like, I would be really annoyed if it's just like, your creatures have death touch. That would be really annoying. But yeah,
it's such an annoying effect.
Yeah. But the fact that it's like, you're giving one thing death touch, unless you're like, attacking into the token player and they're just like, okay, and they'll just chump block, you're basically guaranteeing the contact because people just don't want to lose their stuff. So you're basically guaranteeing that you're going to get that trigger. So yeah, seems good. All right, my last card and our overall last card for the day is Rite of the Dragoncaller. This is for 4 red, so 6 mana, an enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery spell, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. Oh, so much power. So much power. Okay, so I have been, for the last few months, ramping up to build a new Spellslinger deck. And I've convinced myself, for a long time, I've been convinced that when I do, I need to build around these kind of effects. The kind of effects that say whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery, some say non-creature, those are technically better, make some kind of creature token. Because then you're going wide, you're adding bodies to the board, so that way you can be attacking and blocking while you're also dirtling around and casting your spells. So that's like my goal, is I'm going to build around these kind of effects. This is arguably one of the worst versions of that effect because it's 6 mana and it only triggers on instants and sorcery. So it's not just non-creatures like a lot of those other effects are. But it makes 5/5 dragons with flying. And those are real clocks, man. Like, even if it's not going to come down to the late game. Yeah, it's not going to trigger on all of your spells. It's still going to add a ton of damage to the board. It's really going to help you close out the game. It's maybe overkill. Maybe it doesn't even make the final cut, but I might just put it in the deck anyways, just because the cool factor is for real.
Yeah,
see, I think this is. Go ahead.
I was going to say, this is one of those cards to me that seems like I'll really want to put it in a deck, but it'll be the 103rd card of that deck every time.
Yeah.
And I'll just be like, it's fun, but I have to cut it to make the deck function properly. If you can make it work, I think it'll be fun, but
I'm not convinced. I think it gets cut, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try really hard.
I honestly think that this card is really, really good in the cantrippy Spellslinger decks. The one where you're, paying 1 mana or 2 mana, per spell, and you're drawing a card, which is probably likely another spell that you could play for 1 or 2 mana, because And for 6 mana, this is definitely, like you said, a later game type of card that you're going to play. But I think that if you just play this and then pass, I think that's incorrect. I think that you at least need to have mana up to cast 1 instant or sorcery to make 1 token off of it. Not even just for the value, but as some way to protect yourself, because this is going to scare players a lot more than it probably should. As soon as they see it, they're going to be like, that's a problem, we need to get rid of it immediately. But in all likelihood, the turn that the person plays this, they're probably not going to be able to abuse it right away. So, but because it does have a powerful effect where you can just create 5/5s for 1 mana or 2 mana based on the type of instants and sorceries you're casting, it's going to draw more hate than it probably deserves. So I think that you want to be able to at least trigger it once when you play it. But it's probably like the best or one of the best cards in those cantrippy type decks where you're just playing a bunch of spells. Like if you're playing a storm deck, this might be really good in that because you're trying to build your storm count up a lot, so you're probably casting a lot of instants and sorceries to help build that up. But I don't think that it's necessarily going to be something that you put into a ton of decks. Like, I know what some of you might be waiting for me to say. This is not something that I would put in Dragon because I don't have a ton of instants and sorceries that I'm going to be playing very reliably.
But it makes dragons, Jason. It makes dragons for the Dragon.
It's 6 mana and it's too specific to instants and sorceries. It's just not good enough.
Yeah, it really hurts me that it's not just non-creature spell, because that would make it way more playable. Okay, so I have a rough idea on what this deck is in my head, right? Because you play all the cards like this, that whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery, you make a creature. Or the better ones are whenever you play a non-creature, you make a non-creature spell, you make a creature token. So you're playing all of these, right? But then you're also playing a lot of token doublers. So you're playing Mondrax and Anointed Procession, which is a non-creature spell. So you're also getting these token doublers and you're just going wide and finishing out the game that way. So the fact that there are non-creature spells that are not instants and sorceries that you're going to want to cast in those kinds of decks really takes this down a notch, especially because it's 6 mana. But the cool factor, the rule of cool, as they call it, of a bunch of 5/5 dragons does sound super epic. So we'll see. It might make the cut. It's probably a little ambitious.
Still cool. Still fun.
All right, guys.
I hope you can find something to do with it.
Yeah, I'll try. But that is going to do it. That is our top 10 cards from Foundations. Overall, we're pretty high on this set. It's even gained Preston reinterested in a standard, which it's been a while since he's played. I think it's going to make standard a lot more enjoyable. I have been playing standard for the last couple of years and been having a lot of fun with it. So, and then obviously it's also bringing some cool new cards for Commander, which is the main thing we play over here on the channel. That's what our gameplay series is. Check that out if you haven't seen it already. Let us know in the comments, what are some of your favorite cards from Foundations? Did we miss any that you are super excited about? We're not talking about reprints. I should have said that at the beginning. We weren't going to talk about reprints. We were only talking about the new cards, but let us know any of your favorite new cards in the comments down below. We'll be back next week. We got a couple more before we take a break for the holiday season. Have a good week. We'll see you later. Bye.